The silence in Riverside Academy's grand auditorium was deafening. At the center of it all stood Patricia Williams, a 42-year-old black woman in her crisp marine dress blue uniform, ribbons and decorations gleaming on her chest, face to face with Jake Morrison, a burly security guard whose hand was firmly gripped around her upper arm. "Ma'am, you need to leave. You don't belong here," Jake said, his voice filled with false authority as he stared at a decorated Marine in full dress uniform. His partner, Tony Rodriguez, stood beside him, backing up his colleague's demands. Patricia's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Her words carried the unmistakable authority of someone who commanded troops under enemy fire. "I suggest you remove your hand before I remove it for you." This wasn't a request. This wasn't even a warning. This was a promise. Jake Morrison's grip tightened, his face flushed red with embarrassment and stubborn authority. "Your name isn't on our list of approved attendees. You can't sit in the front section." Even while staring at a decorated Marine in full dress uniform, something in his prejudiced mind made him believe he could physically remove her from her own son's graduation ceremony. But something in Patricia's eyes made him hesitate. Something that whispered of danger, of consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The entire graduation crowd was mesmerized. Phones emerged from purses and pockets, recording every second of this standoff. Parents who moments before were chatting about their children's achievements suddenly became witnesses to something explosive. Two security guards trying to physically remove a uniformed Marine from her son's graduation because her name wasn't on the list. The tension reached breaking point. Patricia's eyes flashed with controlled fury, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every battle she fought, every injustice she endured. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." And in that moment, as Jake Morrison finally released his grip and took a step back, as the crowd held its collective breath, as phones continued recording what would become viral, Patricia Williams looked directly into the cameras and said the words that would change everything. "Let me tell you exactly how we got to this moment. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you believe our veterans should be respected, hit that subscribe button right now and tell us in the comment where you're watching from." The story involves a Marine in full dress uniform being told she doesn't belong at her own son's graduation, 6 Navy SEALs who would appear like guardian angels, and a moment of justice so powerful it would restore your faith in humanity. But to understand how we got to that explosive confrontation, we need to go back to the beginning of this remarkable day. To understand what led to that explosive confrontation, you need to know exactly who Patricia Williams is. Because this wasn't just any mother fighting for her right to attend graduation. This was a Master Sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, standing in full dress blue uniform, wearing every ribbon and decoration she earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Patricia Williams was 42 years old, and for the past 20 years, she served her country with distinction. The ribbons on her chest told a story that most people would never fully understand. Each one represented missions completed, lives saved, and sacrifices made in service to her nation. Her Bronze Star ribbon sat prominently among them, earned through extraordinary heroism under enemy fire. But what made Patricia's presence in that auditorium even more powerful was what she chose to wear that day. She didn't arrive in civilian clothes. She didn't try to blend in with the other parents. She came to her son's graduation in her full Marine dress blue uniform, complete with every decoration she earned over 2 decades of service. This wasn't about showing off or making a statement. This was about honor, tradition, and celebrating the most important moment in her son's life while representing the values that shaped both of their lives. She was a single mother who balanced military service with raising her son alone. 8 years ago, when Marcus was just 10 years old, Patricia received the knock on the door that every military spouse fears. Her husband, Staff Sergeant David Williams, was killed by an IED in Afghanistan. In one moment, Patricia went from being a military wife to a widow, from having a partner in raising their son to facing the world alone. But Patricia Williams was not the type of woman who gave up. Instead of leaving the military after her husband's death, she doubled down on her commitment to serve. She continued her deployments, continued leading Marines in combat, all while ensuring Marcus got everything he needed to succeed. The sacrifices she made were extraordinary. Between deployments, Patricia worked extra duties and took on additional responsibilities to earn the money needed for Marcus to attend Riverside Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. She missed school events because she was deployed overseas. She spent birthdays and holidays away from her son because duty called. And it worked. Marcus Williams, now 18 years old, was everything his mother dreamed he could become. He wasn't just graduating that day. He was graduating as valedictorian of his class with a perfect 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to MIT. This young man was respectful, driven, and absolutely determined to make his mother proud of every sacrifice she made. Marcus planned to study engineering at MIT and then follow in both his parents' footsteps by joining the Marines. He saw his mother's strength, her dedication, her unwavering commitment to service, and it shaped him into a young man of extraordinary character. Now there was also Principal Robert Henderson, who worked at Riverside Academy for 15 years. He was genuinely a good man who cared about all his students, regardless of their background. Henderson watched Marcus grow from a quiet 10-year-old, dealing with his father's death, into the confident young man graduating as valedictorian. He respected Patricia immensely and knew exactly what she sacrificed to get Marcus to this point. But here was Henderson's problem. He was caught between doing what was right and managing the wealthy board members who essentially controlled the school through their massive donations. He was well-meaning, but when push came to shove, he often found himself powerless against the board's influence. And that brings us to the real villains of this story. Richard Sterling and Victoria Hayes, two board members who believed their money gave them the right to control everything that happened at Riverside Academy, even when it meant disrespecting a uniformed Marine. Richard Sterling, a real estate mogul in his 60s, the kind of man who measured his worth by the number of buildings he owned and the size of his bank account. He donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the academy over the years, and in his mind, they gave him ownership rights over everything that happened there, including who got to attend graduation ceremonies. But Victoria Hayes was even worse. She was a judge's wife who never worked a day in her life but believed her husband's position and her family's old money made her superior to everyone around her. She was the type of woman who could look at a decorated Marine in full dress uniform and still believe she possessed the right to remove that Marine from the building. Both Sterling and Hayes harbored such deep-seated prejudices that they could look at Patricia Williams, a woman clearly displaying 20 years of military service on her chest, and decide she didn't belong at their exclusive academy. They saw the color of her skin before they saw the uniform she wore, the ribbons she earned, or the sacrifices she made. These were the people who created the list that mysteriously didn't include Patricia's name. These were the people who instructed security guards, Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez, to remove a uniformed Marine from her own son's graduation ceremony. They were about to learn that there are some battles you simply cannot win. Because what Sterling and Hayes didn't know, what nobody in that auditorium knew, except for Patricia herself, was that 20 minutes before that confrontation, she received a text message that would change everything. A message from 6 men who served under her command, who saw her leadership under fire, who never forgot the Marine who brought them all home alive. The message was simple. On our way. Mom. Patricia Williams arrived at Riverside Academy 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She wasn't being overly eager. She was being strategic. As a Marine, she understood the importance of securing the best position for the mission at hand. And that day's mission was simple. Witness her son's graduation with the honor and dignity that both she and Marcus earned. She dressed in her full Marine dress blue uniform, every ribbon and decoration perfectly positioned according to military regulations. Patricia made her way directly to the front row, selecting a seat with a perfect view of the stage. She placed her military cover on the chair to reserve it and began setting up her camera, adjusting angles to ensure she'd capture Marcus receiving his diploma from every possible perspective. As other parents began filtering into the auditorium, the stares started immediately. But these weren't the curious glances that a military uniform typically attracted. These were different. Longer, more calculating, filled with something that made Patricia's military instincts sharpen with awareness. These parents arrived in designer suits and dresses that cost more than Patricia made in 3 months. Their jewelry sparkled under the chandeliers, their shoes were fresh from boutiques Patricia never even walked past. But what struck Patricia most were their expressions when they looked at her uniform. Not respect, not gratitude, but something that bordered on suspicion. The whispers started quietly but grew more obvious. Parents glanced at Patricia, then leaned over to whisper something to their companions, then looked back again. Some pulled out their phones, not to take pictures of the beautiful auditorium, but to text their friends about the situation developing in the front row. That was when Richard Sterling and Victoria Hayes made their entrance. Sterling was impossible to miss in his custom-tailored suit, walking with the swagger of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. Hayes glided beside him in a dress that probably cost more than Patricia's monthly military pay, her pearl necklace catching the light as she surveyed the seating arrangement with obvious displeasure. Their eyes locked onto Patricia immediately. Sterling's jaw tightened, and Hayes' perfectly practiced smile turned icy. The sight of a black woman in military uniform sitting in the front row clearly violated their sense of proper order. They approached Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez, the 2 security guards stationed near the entrance. Jake Morrison was a big man in his early 40s, the type who probably played high school football and never quite got over his glory days. He carried himself with false authority, the kind that came from wearing a uniform and having the power to tell people what to do. Tony Rodriguez was younger, probably in his late 20s, and seemed less comfortable with confrontation, but clearly followed his partner's lead. Sterling's conversation with the guards was animated but quiet. Patricia watched as he gestured toward her, his face growing redder with each word. Hayes nodded along, adding her own commentary with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. The guards approached Patricia with obvious reluctance. Even Jake, for all his bluster, seemed to understand that confronting a uniformed Marine was different from dealing with typical troublemakers. "Ma'am," Jake began, his voice carrying forced authority, "we're going to need to see some identification and verify your invitation." Patricia looked up calmly, her military training keeping her voice steady. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Tony shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. "Well, we've been told there might be some confusion about the guest list. Your name doesn't appear to be on our approved attendee roster." Patricia pulled out her graduation invitation and her military ID, holding both up clearly. "Marcus Williams is my son. This invitation was mailed to my home address, and this ID confirms my identity." Jake took the documents, examining them with exaggerated scrutiny. "The thing is, ma'am, we've been instructed that only pre-approved guests can sit in the front sections. This appears to be some kind of mix-up. But Patricia Williams didn't survive 20 years in the Marines by backing down from bureaucratic bullying. And who exactly maintains this approved list that apparently excludes the mother of your valedictorian?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake's face reddened, and Tony looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation they found themselves in. That was when Victoria Hayes approached directly, abandoning any pretense of working through intermediaries. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "The front sections are traditionally reserved for major donors and board members. I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in one of the other sections." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow. Here she stood, in full military dress uniform, her service record displayed on her chest for all to see, and she was told she didn't belong in the front row of her own son's graduation. "I'll be sitting right here," Patricia replied, her voice carrying the quiet authority that commanded Marines in combat zones. But Sterling and Hayes weren't finished. They whispered urgently to Henderson, who appeared looking like a man caught between impossible choices. You could see the conflict written all over his face. He knew exactly who Patricia was, knew what she sacrificed for Marcus, knew this was wrong. But Sterling and Hayes held the financial power that kept the academy running. "Mrs. Williams," Henderson began, his voice apologetic but weak, "perhaps we could find you an excellent seat in the middle section? The view is actually quite good from there." Before Patricia could respond, Jake Morrison stepped forward with renewed confidence, emboldened by the board members' support. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move. This is a private institution, and we have our policies." The humiliation was complete. Patricia Williams, Master Sergeant, United States Marine Corps Bronze Star recipient, was asked to move from the front row of her son's graduation because her name supposedly wasn't on some mysterious list. But rather than create a scene that might embarrass Marcus, Patricia gathered her dignity around her like armor and moved to a seat in the middle section. The stares followed her, the whispers continued, and the phones kept recording this unprecedented treatment of a uniformed service member. If you were in Patricia's shoes, would you have allowed them to move you out of the front seat on your son's graduation day? Share your thoughts in the comments and hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying the story. If you don't move to the middle seat, you will have to leave this graduation ceremony and not see your son climb the stage, the guards said to Patricia. This made Patricia finally leave her front seat. She didn't want anything to come against her seeing her son climb the stage. When the ceremony began and Marcus walked across the stage as valedictorian, Patricia watched her son's eyes search the crowd until they found her in the middle section. The disappointment that flashed across his face was like a knife to her heart. This was supposed to be his perfect day, and instead, he was witnessing his mother being treated as less than equal in her own country. But Marcus Williams was his mother's son. When he stepped up to the podium to deliver his valedictorian speech, his words carried a weight that made the entire auditorium uncomfortable. "Excellence isn't determined by the size of your bank account or the neighborhood you come from," Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. "True character is revealed not by how you treat those who can benefit you, but by how you treat those you think are powerless to fight back. Some of you in this audience today have shown exactly who you really are." The auditorium fell silent. Everyone knew exactly what he was talking about and exactly who his words were directed toward. It was during Marcus's speech that Patricia felt her phone buzz with a text message. She glanced down and for the first time all day, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. The message was short and simple. "On our way. Hoo-yah." But the harassment wasn't finished. As Marcus concluded his speech and the diploma presentations began, Patricia stood up to take photographs of her son's moment of triumph. That was when both Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez appeared beside her again. "Ma'am, you're going to need to sit down. You're disrupting the ceremony," Jake said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. Patricia looked around. Parents throughout the auditorium were standing, taking pictures, cheering for their children. She was doing nothing different from anyone else, except for the color of her skin, and the fact that she was already marked as someone who didn't belong. "I'm taking pictures of my son receiving his diploma," Patricia said firmly. "The same thing every other parent here is doing." "Well, you're being disruptive," Tony insisted, clearly following his partner's lead. "We're going to need you to sit down or leave." That was when Jake Morrison made the biggest mistake of his career. Emboldened by the board members' earlier support and his partner's backing, he reached for Patricia's arm, intending to physically guide her toward the exit. The moment his hand made contact with her uniform, everything changed. Patricia Williams, Master Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, looked up at him with eyes that saw combat, eyes that commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. "I suggest you remove your hand before I remove it for you." The entire auditorium fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every phone was recording. Jake Morrison's face flushed red as Tony moved closer. Both guards trying to use their combined presence to intimidate a decorated Marine. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Patricia said, her voice carrying 20 years of military authority. And that was when the auditorium doors at the back of the room opened. 6 men in Navy dress uniforms entered the auditorium. Not casually, not quietly, but in perfect military formation. Their steps were synchronized, their bearing unmistakable. These weren't just any servicemen. These were Navy SEALs, America's elite warriors, and they were marching with purpose down the center aisle. The entire auditorium turned to watch as these 6 warriors moved through the crowd like a force of nature. Parents scrambled out of their way, phones captured every step, and the tension that was building all day reached its breaking point. The lead SEAL was a man in his early 30s, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of multiple combat deployments and extraordinary service. His name was Chief Petty Officer Michael Chen, and he walked directly toward the confrontation at Patricia's seat. Without hesitation, Chen positioned himself between Patricia and the 2 security guards, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of America's finest warriors. "Step away from Master Sergeant Williams, now." Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez froze. The color drained from their faces as they realized they just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Chen turned to address the stunned auditorium, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, United States Marine Corps. We served under her command during 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan." The 5 other SEALs moved to flank Patricia, creating an honor guard around the woman who was treated like she didn't belong. "We heard through the military network that Master Sergeant Williams' son was graduating today," Chen continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "We came to honor our former commanding officer and to witness the graduation of the son of one of America's finest warriors." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Richard Sterling's face went pale. Victoria Hayes looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Principal Henderson stood frozen, realizing the magnitude of what just occurred under his watch. And Patricia Williams, the woman they tried to humiliate, stood surrounded by 6 of America's most elite warriors, finally receiving a fraction of the respect she earned through 20 years of service to her country. What happened next will give you chills and restore your faith in justice. The 6 Navy SEALs positioned themselves in a protective formation around Patricia Williams, creating a wall of honor that spoke louder than any words ever could. These weren't just any servicemen. These were America's most elite warriors, and they came to honor the woman who once commanded their respect in the most dangerous places on Earth. Chief Petty Officer Michael Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of leading men into battle. But when he spoke, it wasn't with anger or aggression. It was with the quiet dignity of a warrior paying tribute to another warrior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen began, his words echoing through the now silent auditorium, "you have spent this afternoon disrespecting one of America's finest heroes. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams didn't just serve her country, she bled for it." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Parents who were whispering and recording suddenly found themselves unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen, as the truth was finally revealed. "Master Sergeant Williams is a Bronze Star recipient," Chen continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She earned that medal by risking her own life to save 5 Marines who were pinned down under heavy enemy fire in Afghanistan. While bullets flew around her, while mortars exploded nearby, she ran into the kill zone not once, not twice, but 3 times to drag wounded Marines to safety." You could see the shock rippling through the crowd. These were the same people who questioned her right to sit in the front row, who stared at her uniform and decided she didn't belong at their exclusive academy. "She's also a Purple Heart recipient," Chen added, and now his voice carried the weight of shared combat experience. "Master Sergeant Williams was wounded by an IED while leading a convoy through hostile territory. She stayed conscious long enough to coordinate the evacuation of her entire unit before allowing medics to treat her own injuries." The auditorium became a cathedral of silence. Parents who moments before were recording Patricia's humiliation lowered their phones, shame written across their faces. "Master Sergeant Williams served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan," Chen continued. "She led Marines through some of the most dangerous territory in the world. She brought every single one of her Marines home alive. Every single one." Richard Sterling's face went from red to pale white. His hands were shaking, and for the first time in his life, his money and influence meant absolutely nothing. Victoria Hayes looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, her perfect composure cracking under the weight of her own prejudice. The 5 other SEALs stood at attention, their silence more powerful than any speech. These were men who saw combat, who understood sacrifice, who knew exactly what Patricia Williams gave for her country, and they were there to make sure she received the respect she earned. Sterling was the first to try to recover, stumbling over his words as he attempted an apology. "Master Sergeant Williams, we didn't know if we knew." But Chen cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. "You didn't know because you never bothered to look beyond the color of her skin. You saw what you wanted to see, and you treated a decorated war hero like she was less than human." Victoria Hayes stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're so sorry. We made a terrible mistake." The apologies rang hollow in the vast auditorium. These weren't expressions of genuine remorse. They were the desperate attempts of people trying to save face after being exposed for who they truly were. Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez stood frozen, realizing they just committed career suicide by physically confronting a decorated Marine in front of 6 Navy SEALs and hundreds of recording phones. Principal Henderson, realizing the magnitude of what occurred under his watch, finally found his voice. "Master Sergeant Williams," he said, his words carrying genuine respect and shame, "would you please allow us to escort you back to the front row, where you should have been sitting all along?" But the ceremony was already nearing its end. Marcus Williams watched this entire scene unfold from the stage, his emotions cycling through shock, pride, and overwhelming love for the mother who sacrificed everything for him. The SEALs remained in formation as the final diplomas were awarded, creating an honor guard that transformed the entire atmosphere of the graduation. What began as an exercise in prejudice and exclusion became a powerful demonstration of respect and military brotherhood. When Marcus Williams' name was called, he walked across that stage not just as valedictorian, but as the son of a hero. The SEALs saluted as he received his diploma, and for the first time all day, the applause was genuine and thunderous. After the ceremony concluded, as families began to mill around taking pictures and celebrating, Patricia Williams rose from her seat. The conversations gradually died down as people realized she was preparing to speak. When Patricia addressed the crowd, her voice carried the authority of 20 years of military service, the wisdom of someone who saw humanity at its worst and best, and the quiet dignity of a mother who endured humiliation for the sake of her son's education. "I didn't serve 3 tours in Afghanistan, so my son could be treated as less than equal in his own country," Patricia began, her words cutting through the auditorium like a sword of truth. "I fought for every person in this room to have the freedom to judge others by their character, not their appearance." The silence was absolute. Parents who spent the day whispering and staring found themselves unable to look away from this woman they so badly misjudged. "Today, some of you chose to judge by the uniform I was wearing, but not the one I earned the right to wear," Patricia continued, her voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You saw a black woman in military dress and decided I didn't belong in your world. You never asked who I was, what I did, or what I sacrificed." Some parents were openly crying now, finally understanding the magnitude of their prejudice and the injustice they participated in. "Remember that the next time you see someone who looks different from you," Patricia concluded, her final words hanging in the air like a challenge and a promise. "You never know what battles they've already won." The applause that followed wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, sustained, and filled with the kind of respect that Patricia Williams earned through 20 years of service, but was denied until 6 Navy SEALs walked through those doors. Marcus Williams embraced his mother on that stage, surrounded by America's elite warriors, finally learning the full extent of the sacrifices she made, not just for him, but for every person in that auditorium. The woman they tried to humiliate fought for their freedom to humiliate her. And that, folks, was how a decorated Marine reminded an entire room full of people that heroes don't always look the way you expect them to look. Sometimes they're wearing dress blue uniforms with ribbons that tell stories of sacrifice and service. Sometimes they're sitting quietly, watching their children succeed despite a world that told them they didn't belong. But they earned their place at the front of every room. And sometimes it takes 6 Navy SEALs to remind everyone else of that truth. The guards who dared to put their hands on a decorated Marine? They learned that day that some mistakes you never recover from. The board members who created their exclusive list? They discovered that money couldn't buy back respect once you've lost it through prejudice. But Patricia Williams? She walked out of that auditorium with her head held high, surrounded by warriors who honored her service, carrying the knowledge that she raised a son who would carry her values into the world. That was justice. That was honor. And that was a reminder that in America, heroism comes in all colors, and true patriots defend each other when it matters most. Hundreds of recording phones. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and share with others to learn too. See you in our next video.